This weekend, the RNC was roundly criticized for this tweet, crediting Rosa Parks' bold stand and her role in ending racism. 3 hours later, the RNC was forced to fire off an update celebrating Parks' bold stand and her role in fighting to end racism. Of course, by then, it was too late. By then, the hashtag racism ended when had already been launched, and another Republican outreach effort to minorities had met its tragic end. The debacle occurred days before Senator Rand Paul heads to Detroit to help open the party's African American Engagement Office. One Republican strategist told the Huffington Post the party should have an office in Detroit, but calling it the African American Engagement Office is absurd, offensive, and pathetic. Indeed, it is not the first time Rand Paul has engaged in absurd, pathetic, and yes, some would say offensive minority outreach. Recall, if you will, his speech at Howard University this April.
I mean, how many of you would have, if I would have said, who do you think the founders of the NAACP are? Do you think they were Republicans or Democrats? Would everybody in here know they were all Republicans?
Yes.
All right. You know more than I know. Okay, and I don't mean that to be insulting. I don't know what you know, and you don't, I mean, I'm trying to find out what the connection is.
Back at the RNC, Chairman Reince Priebus has been trying to make good on his goal of making inroads with minorities after his post-election autopsy proudly asserted that the African American community has a lot in common with the Republican Party. The RNC must be committed to building a lasting relationship year-round based on mutual respect and with a spirit of caring. So far, the progress on that front has been dim. Writes Jonathan Capehart, autopsies are done on dead things. And ever since its March 2013 release, the GOP has done everything possible to stay dead. Take Priebus himself, weighing in on America's first black president.
It's the culture that the president's cultivated here. I mean, a culture of dishonesty, a culture of hatred. I think he should take ownership over this divisive culture that he has created.
A divisive culture of dishonesty and hatred. And yet, when the president weighed in on the thing that most divides us, race, his comments were honest, and they were unifying, and they were fundamentally optimistic.
I don't want us to lose sight that things are getting better. Doesn't mean we're in a post-racial society. It doesn't mean that racism is eliminated. But when I talk to Malia and Sasha, and I listen to their friends and I see them interact, they're better than we are. They're better than we were.
As far as cultivating a culture of dishonesty and division, perhaps the Republican Party should hold up a mirror.
Now, is the president easing racial tension or stoking racial tension?
Indeed, as long as the grand old party continues to practice the nullification strategy of the old Confederate South, it's going to have a hard time winning new voters regardless of their color. Jonathan, you have one of my favorite columns on this very subject, so I go to you first. You wrote, the GOP might as well be dead. Sure, the tweet was later corrected, but come on, people. The lowest level black person at the RNC could have told them that the tweet was flat out wrong and offensive. Not that anyone would have listened, assuming there are any low level black people there, which is hilarious, but also probably true. I mean, when we talk about the minority outreach, I think one of the biggest problems is it's completely cosmetic. There is no there.
Right. When you look at the GOP autopsy, it's so airy-fairy. We must use best practices about how to reach out to the African American community. Best practices is that nonsense word that's used in the consultancy world, which means we don't know what to do and we don't know how to go about this, so let's talk to somebody else who might have the answer. This would not have happened. The Rosa Parks tweet would not have happened. The unfurling of the Confederate flag in front of the White House would not have happened. Larry Klayman would not have been allowed to stand with a sitting U.S. Senator, Republican U.S. Senator, and the 2008 Republican vice presidential nominee had Michael Steele. The black former chairman of the RNC had been the chair of the Republican Party because he knows what kind of message that sends to African Americans, what that does for the reputation of the Republican Party, and he would know to stop it. look, I give the Republican Party, the RNC, great credit for correcting the tweet 3 hours later. But the problem is the tweet went out in the first place.
Yeah, and then that there is a sense that some corners of the Republican Party believe that racism is in fact over. I mean, you know,
we're the real racists if we say that there's still a problem with racism. That, you know, that's the really divisive
right. That's the racially divisive thing to bring up.
The liberal racist, you know, Obama's
stoking race hatred
talk about
because it works for us at the booths. I mean, but Michael Eric Dyson, the idea that, I mean, on some level, right, one wants to say, good on you that you're trying to trying to engage with black people in Detroit. But it's almost more insulting to do that in a purely cosmetic sort of marketing fashion, as Jonathan explains, than substantively, which is to rethink the policies that disenfranchise minority voters, be they at the voting booth or in terms of actual, like, economic policy.
Well, when it comes to race, they're victims of the soft bigotry of low expectations.
Yes, yes, they are.
So the reality is, the conversation has swung so far to the right that any indication that they're interested seems to be worthy of self-congratulation. So my students who dare to come to class, look, I'm here. I didn't read the book. I didn't engage the article, but professor, give me credit, I'm here.
I showed up. Yep.
Really? Be quiet right now so I won't even flunk you for worse. So the reality is that the Republican Party has unfortunately caved into the belief that racism is equal to the manifestation of systematic bigotry. They don't see racism persisting in voting rights acts or the nullification of them. They don't see the words, the revival of nullification and interposition. They don't see the fact that there is tremendous concentration of poor people in not only in prisons, but in poor schools. There's a way in which the unintended consequences of racial policies have a negative consequence. You don't have to have a racist intent to have a racial consequence. And so the Republican Party can't wrap their minds around it. And as Joan just indicated, those of us who even speak about race are then blamed. Aha, you're the ones who are fomenting division and dissent in America, as opposed to joining with us to deal with racial realities. So they believe Rosa parked racism. They believe that Martin Luther King Jr. was the be-all and end-all.
By virtue of that logic. I mean, Harold, the reason we played that clip of the president speaking extemporaneously after the Trayvon Martin verdict came in is because the last thing he was doing was stoking racial division. I thought it was one of the best moments of his presidency. It was so real, and it was something for even people that think about race, who are sort of comfortably liberal and progressive. The notion that the president of the United States once heard doors click shut or women grab their handbags tighter in the elevator is a horrifying, very disjunctive idea in terms of the America in which we live, and important for people to hear.
There's no doubt. Look, I agree with just about everything that's been said. If I were a Republican, I mean, I'd be out asking Chris Christie, how'd you win 20% of the African American vote? I would reach out to Tim Scott and say, look, why don't you become a face and a voice for some of the things that we're trying to do? You can't call your outreach office the African American Engagement Office in Detroit. If you really care about Detroit, they've got an $18 billion worth of liabilities. Try to help the Republican Party to make a commitment, a federal commitment to try to help them navigate. How do you get more police on the street and get their fire department up and running again? If they're serious about it, be about policies. Like this silly tweet that was sent, I'm thankful they corrected it as well. But one of the things what I think about also is our school system in this country might not be teaching kids that these things, these very things, because I doubt that intent. To your point, the intent may not have been there, Michael, but the consequence is a big one. And we've got to figure out how we address the consequences as much as the intent.
Absolutely right. But look at what's happening in Texas right now. They just now, this is a true story. The Texas Commission that determines the textbooks, and Texas is huge. What Texas does, the rest of the country follows. So now, because of budget cuts, if Texas adopts 1 million books that are textbooks, then the rest of the country says, we're not going to reinvent the wheel, we're going to do it. What did Texas want to do? They wanted to cut out the word slavery. They wanted to call it the Atlantic trade, not even the Atlantic slave trade. They wanted to call they didn't want to name Barack Obama by name, but when they finally did, they said they wanted to call him Barack Hussein Obama. But this is the kind of pejorative...
Insidious.
It's insidious, but it's also manipulative, and it's a kind of racial amnesia. As Gore Vidal said, we live in the United States of amnesia, and the addiction to forgetfulness is something that's rampant, and those of us who are just disjointed reminders of the racial truths that lurk just beneath the surface are seen as the very cause of the very problem. If you can't like Barack Obama, and let me tell you what, there are a lot of people to his left who say, dude, when you say that because of age, that younger people, there are a lot of instances of the renaissance of racism among younger people. So even his optimism is not granted by the right wing the kind of, power and substance that it should otherwise curb.
But I think, Joan, the more that the right feels like they've been put back on their heels on the subject of race, the more defiant the sort of more intolerant pockets of the Republican Party become on this issue specifically. And the more this kind of cemented narrative of the more this narrative of two Americas gets cemented, which is this the brown takers and the rest of us. And that's why, changing not just the pizza box, but the actual pizza that's in the box at the Republican, it's going to be, I mean, from my cold dead hands, I don't know how they do it.
Well, the transformation of the Republican Party from the Southern strategy to the Northern strategy of the Southern strategy, which is just as important, playing on race, playing on the racial fear of so-called white ethnics, they have not recovered from that, and they simply don't know how to go forward and win an election without relying. At the end of the day, they talk a lot about change, but they can't walk away from that fearful older white base, whether it's on immigration reform or on reaching out to African Americans.
And they force it into implicit status too. They've been forced into implicit status. They believe that because it's not explicit and overt, therefore it's not real, and they've been forced into implicit inferential racism, and as a result of that, they can't negotiate. Read the brilliant new book by Jacqueline Jones called A Dreadful Deceit to see how the transformation of race from the very beginning of this republic down to Obama's presidency, for how we can begin to at least address some of these issues.
Alex, the Chiron there says minority reports, and look, if the Republican Party does not go back to the hard truths that were in the first 12 pages of the GOP autopsy, the Republican Party will be a minority party. What they're doing with African Americans, they've re-energized the African American base for Democrats by not doing anything on comprehensive immigration reform, which was the big hallmark of the autopsy. They've turned off, generally speaking, Latino voters to the Republican Party. If you look at some of the polls that came out before, I believe it was Latino Voices did a poll that showed that while folks would vote Democratic, if you asked them if they were liberal or conservative, Latino voters who were polled were mostly conservatives. Republicans are leaving votes on the table, and we're talking African Americans and Latinos at the moment, but you could add women, you could add young people, you could add lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered Americans. And if the Republican Party wants to remain a minority party, then they can continue to say no to all of those constituencies.
And Jonathan Capehart gets the last word in this segment.
I'd snap, but that be.
Yeah, no. You did a verbal snap.